They hit the circuit breaker at 5. Where it opened, went down another 2. They closed it at every school. I said a red Chinese government school.
Good afternoon. I'd like to, if I could have your attention, please. Welcome our committee members, the school committee members, and our visitors. I'd like to call the meeting of the Finance Committee for Thursday, January 7th to order. And I'd also like to turn it over briefly to Pauline, who is going to call the school committee to order.
So I'd like to pull together the school committee meeting of January 7th, joint session between Finance Committee and Board of Selectmen. May I have a motion to accept the agenda? So moved. Second. All in favor? Aye. So moved. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Pauline. Is there any public comment to come before the Finance Committee or this joint meeting today to items that are not on our agenda? The Finance Committee, I think I'll just, if I could, I will defer the minutes until we review the school building project appropriation and funding. I'll go right to item 4. So I think we've circulated the Finance Committee some current, most recent estimates for the construction budget and the project cost for the new school and renovations. You saw the recommendations or the analysis performed by Brian and Libby, who were here to talk about those. And this will be a conversation we want to have together with the school committee as we look at alternatives. And I would ask Michael, I thought it might be helpful to have just a brief kind of summary of this project and how we got to where we are today, and the very robust process the school committee and their project, school project committee used to come to where we are today. So I'll turn it over to Michael for the
Thank you. I don't want to take us all the way back and cover all of the ground, but I think the enrollment growth and space challenges in our school district have been evident for several years. And we've done a lot of work, certainly in the last 5 years, laying out the foundation of that enrollment growth and what it means for the elementary, middle, and high school. 2 years ago, we began in earnest with a building committee that involved many representatives of the many constituencies in the community. And there are several people here today who participated in that. The process was a little bit different in that we needed to move fast, and so we didn't separate the design stage and the construction stage in bringing it. I think if we had the luxury of time, we probably would have done that. But in the need to move quickly, we came to the annual meeting last April. I think we were very grateful, appreciative of the community who clearly has recognized the need for more space and was, again, appreciative and astonished at the annual meeting when it wasn't even called. And so since that time, we have selected our architects, SMRT of Andover, Mass. And we've been working with them in overtime and overdrive to move forward with the project. We then selected the voters project manager, who is now known as Colliers, and formerly SBC. SBS, thank you. And selected the OPM, and we have fast-tracked this as quickly as we can. As as you may remember, the original appropriation at annual town meeting was $44,800,000. You have that on the spreadsheet that we provided for you. And then with the support of FinCom, they added $1.4 million for the purchase of land that maybe would help the immediate project, but also would help us plan for space needs in the future. So the total appropriation was 46.2. Since that time, we have spent $950,000 on the purchase of 32 Surfside, which was an adjacent home, and then the project costs were a little bit over $5 million to date. So the balance of the appropriation is $40 million. Recently, we had the bids come in, the general contracting bids. There were 2 bids that came in on this project. I think many of you probably have already picked up on the fact that the bids for the general bid over $34 million were only $2,000 apart. Those 2 bids, which is just boggles my mind that you could have a project of that size and 2 bids come in tight. So they came in. We decided to put the bids out with a base bid and 3 alternates to the base bid. The base bid was the construction of the new intermediate school. Alternate number 1 was the construction of the renovation project at the middle school. Alternate 2 was the paving. We did that because the sub-bid that had come in previously on the paving was very high in our estimation. So that's why we put it out as an alternate, so that we'd have some flexibility to accept or not. And then the third alternate was a pergola that was part of the intermediate school. When the bids came in, we declined to move forward with the pergola, which was alternate 3, and we took out the paving of alternate 2 and decided that we would accomplish that. Still had to be done, but perhaps work with the town contract to get that in at a lower cost for us. The future work you can see on the spreadsheet. I'm not going to go down and name every piece of that, but the funding needed to complete based on the higher bid than we expected, and you can see the cost estimates besides the base bids would be about $4.2 million. We do have 2 projects out of the Capital 16 that we can reappropriate to bring that down to about a 3.789 that you see at the bottom. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if I elaborated enough.
That's right.
And I would like to say that our architects are here, Dick Webb and Steve Gribben from SMRT are here if there are questions that they might be able to answer. Diane is well versed in procurement and in the project. Peter McEachern sat on the project and Don Holgate through the project. So there have been a lot of people. Of course, the administrative team has spent a great deal of time. Dan Bartlett, Dave Fredericks are some other names that have been served on that committee and helped us at every turn. I'm sure I've missed people, and I don't want to, so if I name some people.
Thank you. I think with 3 members of the Board of Selectmen, Libby, do we need to call? So I'd ask the incoming walking
Board of Selectmen meeting to order.
So, Bobby, we've just, Michael just kind of reviewed where we are with the project and the gap of $3.8 million. Libby and Brian, do you want to make any comments before we get into the actual?
Not really. We've met with Mike and Diane earlier in the week about the potential funding options, and I think you have them before you, and we've sent them around to our board as well.
So I will ask members of the Finance Committee what questions you might have.
Since it's that small project, I guess try to familiarize myself with what we usually do. I talked about the capital project behind the skate park last time.
What?
The project we
Skate
had
park.
behind the skate park where we were going to build those 2 garages. I was just wondering what happened with that. And if we seem to get behind on those projects, those must be escalating also because it should have been 2 years ago.
The skate park is a project that we have been working on. We've been really working with the Bacchus Hamlet because the deed restrictions on building there are specific, and so that has taken a little bit of time, and we're hopeful that, and that was just storage, that wasn't housing or office space or anything else. We are in desperate need of that storage. Typically what happens when you build buildings and try to cut the square footage to make them work and palatable in the cost realm, you lose storage. And I think we've seen that probably with all 3 of our buildings. Or storage that spaces that were storage become tutoring spaces and office spaces. So we're in need of it. We're still working on it. We'd like to get it underway in the springtime.
What other members maybe think you have questions? I'd like to, mention this to Michael earlier, I'd like to discuss the 2 contingencies that are currently in the, what I call soft cost of the project, the construction contingency and the owner's contingency. And I want to really get a description of what the elements of those are, and now that you're at CD construction drawing, you've got confirmed bids, a 10% or so contingency. I'd like to know why, just have a conversation about why you're being so conservative on the contingencies, and you may want to have your architects there.
Thank you. I would. I'd like to invite Dick Webb and I think Diane and he can tag team that a little bit. We have enough money to move forward with the project. Our concern is that if we do that, the contingency is gone as soon as we begin the project. And so what we're asking really is money to backfill that contingency. And that's a concern. But if Dick can speak to contingency and perhaps answer some of your questions.
And again, Mr. Chairman, you did mention when we talk about contingencies, there are 2 contingencies for this project. A construction contingency, which is typically represented for items, again, the project has been designed, it has been bid, it has been designed and defined, I'll say, with product, with materials. Contractor has bid the work. However, during construction, unforeseen conditions will arise. It might be a geotechnical condition, subsurface, when we dig into the ground. As we designed the project, I should note that I think over 35 borings were taken of the entire area of the school facility, so a very representative sampling of the earthwork condition, but until you physically dig out every square foot, every square inch, you don't know what sometimes you might find subsurface-wise. That's a construction contingency for this type of scenario. The second type of contingency is defined more as an owner's contingency. And that is not a designer's contingency. And for Steve and myself, in other words, the building has been designed and bid. What will happen though, there are still some remaining pieces that have not been bid yet. For instance, there are some fixture furnishings and equipment. There is IT equipment that we have line item budgets for, but we consciously do not want to bid, particularly, for instance, the IT work now, because we want to bid it when it's we get much more current models when it's closer to the point of occupancy. The school, again, remember that the school is not scheduled to be occupied for another effectively 18 months until September of 17. So these sorts of items, while we have a line item in the project cost for them, we have not bid them yet. So this is one of the types of items that would be characterized as an owner's contingency if those prices happen to be higher than anticipated. So those are the two types of contingencies. We have allocated approximately a 5% number to each of those, and I'm certainly available to answer any other questions with that. John?
Yeah, when you say 5% to each one of them, is that just a figure you apply, or is there some? Do you go through a study where you take the items that you've only given us a few, but I'm sure you've got a whole list of items that could be suspect because they're based on allowances and not a bid. But are these? Did you go through and just list everything and say, all right, here's some probabilities, and go through a real study on that, or is that just a 5%? Said the 5% will cover it?
I think a lot of it is rooted in historical experience, in the sense of this type of project. If we were doing a site-only project, the contingency might even be a little bit higher because the risk of a geotechnical type of condition would be higher. Here, the phrase we use a lot of times, we like to get ourselves out of the ground because then it's much more, some of that uncertainty is behind us. But to answer your question, it's really rooted more in our assessing the type of the project that it is, and based on, again, our experience. And I think it's pretty much I would characterize it as a pretty typical industry standard.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a minute. I mean, I knew this was, personally, I thought this was coming after the fire station. There was just no way. That being said, as a builder, I love the word contingency because it means it's money I can spend. And I just want, I'd like to know from you, have you ever had a project where you had a contingency in place that you didn't use? Because my concern is we give them a $3.5 million contingency and we're going to find ways to spend it on something that wasn't in the budget, or the money never ends up not being used. Just, I'd rather, I just get uncomfortable with contingencies. I mean, I get the building contingency, absolutely. But once you're, as you said, once you're out of the ground, if there's no issues with the foundation, from that point on, there really shouldn't be too many changes. I mean, everything's been structurally engineered. Prices are in, the material prices are in, the labor prices are in. So unless we drastically change the plans, there really shouldn't be that much. So, I have no problem with the contingency being in place, but what I've seen, maybe it's just me, but that money gets used later on for something else. And that's my question is, when you do these projects, have you had projects where you didn't need the contingency and the money wasn't spent?
Absolutely. Yes, I think that whole contingencies can be approached in different manners, and that absolutely has happened in the past, where the contingency is there to be used if needed.
on the contingency, I've built different projects. Is there a process you go through? Because I know banks don't just like to give you money out of the contingency fund. There's a lot of explaining to do. So is there a process other than just someone walking up and saying, we've got, an override? I mean, is there a board that has to sit down and ask for the money and have a good reason for it? Is it that easy to get the contingency money?
The building construction committee has to review all change orders and approve them as a committee. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
well, I made the point that it's money you can spend, but
Is in place.
I've never seen it that way. I have to pry it out of them.
What Bob was talking about, I was trying to get at the same thing in a different way, because I get uncomfortable too with contingencies, because in many cases that I've seen, contingencies are based on experience and a generalized factor, and therefore very hard to track. And I think if that's why, for me, I'd be much more comfortable with a contingency if I knew what exactly the contingencies were covering. And then at some point in time, like Bob said, when we get out of the ground, well, then we look at it and say, gee, we're in pretty good shape now.
Well,
We won't have to spend that construction
just
contingency.
to clarify, I mean, the owner's contingency I totally get, because we haven't bid the IT stuff, there's gonna be other things, we don't know what those numbers are gonna be. It's good to have that number in place, so if you figure $1 million from the bid, and it comes in $1.2 million, you've got the extra 200, you don't have to keep doing what we're doing right now. But the construction contingency at 5% is fine, I even get that, but once you're out of the ground, there really, I would think that there isn't a whole lot there that can trigger anything that we have to hit that contingency fund. The job's been bid, the contractors agreed to a price. If the materials go up 5%, it shouldn't be our problem, it's on the contractor, am I correct?
If a material price goes up, correct, that would be the result of that.
So if we don't change anything, once the foundation's in the ground, there's very little that would trigger a contingency expense.
On a construction contingency, when you're out of the ground, that's an important stage in the project. Unfortunately, Steve and I, another part of construction contingency, as architects, we are not perfect. There may be something missing on the plans that we need to add to the general contractor bid. So that might be part of the construction contingency. But certainly, getting out of the ground is an important milestone from a plan.
Myself personally, I think that we just go for an additional override for this and fund it. That's my first instinct, but my problem with that is that once we fund it, the money's there, it never goes away kind of, and we find ways to use it. Nobody anticipated this, we thought we'd have plenty of money for these contingencies in place when we bid this, just like we did with the fire station.
I guess
Costs have escalated.
And I agree totally, and I'm thinking forward to the town meeting when this would be the third time we come before town meeting, I believe, for funding requests for this project.
What's the problem with this type of
Second
project?
time, like I thought you already said.
This is the problem with government, you have to go out, you figure out what it's gonna cost before you actually draw the plans and bid it. I mean, if I built houses this way, I'd never be able to come up with a budget, it's kind of crazy.
Jim, it just seems to me that this is a project we're building for a long term. We ought to do it the right way. I think town meeting is going to be very receptive and understanding, just as they were with the fire station. I'm not inclined to chip away at the contingency. Hopefully there are enough controls from the management of this town to make sure it's not frivolous, and that we take the difference and we go to town meeting and add it to the original article and get on with it. As Bobby said, I don't think anybody's gonna be surprised. We told them that with the fire station, they can't expect this isn't gonna happen with the school. We're talking about a 50-year project, we're not talking about saving $5 million or $200,000 next year. So I think we just gotta take the best bet and let's go.
And to clarify, I'm on the same page as Rick, because we go and we ask for the override, I just wanna make sure there's good oversight of these contingencies, and we don't find this as a windfall to use on something else later on.
So my experience with the way this entire thing has been approached is it's very thoughtful and thorough and careful in a short period of time. And I'm very confident that they'll finish it well.
Just as what Rick said, I think that I'm with the two of them as far as, I mean, to me, in for a penny, in for a pound. I mean, we're this far, we've got to continue it. I think that somehow, speaking as in town meeting, I would want to hear some assurances that things like contingencies are just not going to be spent. And I think that's kind of and I think that can be done, yes, and I think there can be actually some type of a process set up to make sure that that's done. And I think that's what I'll be finished in a second. And I think that's what I think that's probably the core of what we're talking about is somehow we've got to have some assurances that there's going to be that this is not just there to be spent. And the problem when you and a lot of that, and I'm not sure, and this is an ask when we if we borrow the full amount of the money that's authorized and we don't spend it, what happens to the money that we don't spend?
But it's an authorization to borrow, and you wouldn't have to borrow the entire amount.
Well, first of all, I don't want everybody to think we're going to run out and borrow $50 million tomorrow, or once town meeting approves the supplemental funding. We currently are borrowing on a cash flow schedule, short terms with bond anticipation notes, so I don't envision a scenario where we would have borrowed an extra $3 million that suddenly would just be sitting there in our bank account, okay? First of all, if something like that had happened, then under the borrowing rules, you can reallocate it, reappropriate it to projects that are similar in nature or for similar lengths, but we're not envisioning a scenario. We're only going to borrow what we need for the project and then permanently borrow that. So there's not a scenario where we're going to borrow more money because we have an authorization to do that. That's not the way that I envision this working, nor would I ever advocate a scenario for or a situation like that.
And that's a good argument to make at town meeting.
That's because we all know that there have been projects which we've funded, we have not used all the funds, and then we get into this reallocation, and that's a little quieter process than the major process.
And so what would also happen is, should town meeting approve the supplemental authorization, and we didn't need to use it, the project was done, we permanently borrowed what the bands were, we would then go to town meeting and ask for a rescission of the authorization so that we would no longer have the ability to borrow it once the project is termed out and closed out. So there are, from my perspective, where I sit, there are controls to prevent the money from just being spent or borrowed for some, people's concerns about it being spent on other things. It's not a scenario that's going to happen.
So just to move the topic along, not hearing any objections from the Finance Committee. We have a recommendation from town administration supported by the school committee and the board of selectmen to increase the current authorization by an amount of 3.2.
3.7.
3.7. Does anybody like to make a motion to that? So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion on the part of the Finance Committee? All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Thank you. Thank you all. Mike?
Well, I would just like to say thank you, and just to let you know some of the names of the people who are on the project and who will be our eyes to make sure that the contingency isn't just spent. And we do have educators on there, but Dave Fredericks, Peter McEachern, Dan Bartlett, Chris Morey, Chip Clooney, Charlie Gibson. Those are people who I think are well versed. And I would be happy to invite a member of the Board of Selectmen if they would like to join that group if that was their wish. We'd be happy to have them join the project committee. It's actually the project construction committee at this point. Thank you.
I'll turn the meeting over to Pauline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I would like to make a motion, please, to authorize the superintendent of schools to enter into the contract with Brick Builders Corporation for 506 Plain Street, Suite 201, Marshfield, Mass, for the construction of a new intermediate school and the addition to the Cyrus Pierce Middle School, based on their bid of up to $34,644,349 for the intermediate school, and the alternate number one bid of up to $4,022,000 for the renovation of the middle school. May I have a motion to accept? Second. All in favor? So moved. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And did you want to?
May I adjourn? Yeah. May I have a motion to adjourn? So moved. Second. So moved. Thank you.
Well, again, thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank Libby and Brian who have worked closely with us over the project.
We'll go back to the agenda for the finance committee. We'll go back to the minutes for, maybe take them all at once, December 7th, 10th, 15th.
Motion to approve.
We have to, because we don't
All
have.
in favor, aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Next on the agenda, I'm going to take them out of order a bit to start with the general fund budget recommendations. Ryan and Libby are going to share with us the presentation they made to the Board of Selectmen. And then, in addition to that, is a very lengthy packet. I'll turn it over to them. Do that now.
Do you want me to start, Rick? Okay.
Okay, we'll just start. I think you all have our PowerPoint and some other information in your packet. I think maybe some of you attended our the Board of Selectmen's meeting on.
Page 19. Looks like that's correct.
Some of you probably attended our meeting on December 9th when we gave this presentation to the Board of Selectmen. And just to quickly review our process, we started working on revenue numbers in September or so and developed budget instructions during that month, issued them to the departments at the end of the month. The budget requests were due mid to end of October, and we spent that time into November meeting with all of the departments and reviewing all of their items, developed the budget presentation for the board for its December 9th meeting. We then went to the school committee a week or so later, and then we're scheduled to come to you today. Last night, we had a public hearing at our board meeting, which we typically have to see if there's any public comment about the budget, which there was not. And the way we did our presentation to the board was Brian takes us through the initial numbers, and then I'll review with you some of the specifics about the budget requests. We have a couple of department heads here. Some. Well, the important ones. Thank you. In case you have any specific questions now, but I would anticipate that this kicks off your process and then go from there.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to take you through the revenue and expenditure side of the budget very briefly here. Starting on page 20. During the budget process, we developed revenue projections that total $87,134,684. Of that, a budget was developed projecting $86,843,248. The next page, which is 21, shows the 2017 to 2016 originally presented budgets. It shows it as balanced. So both sides are at the 86,843,248, which would leave us approximately $291,000 under the levy our levy limit.
Okay, so that's the difference between
That's
the
the-
revenue of 87 and
Yes,
the revenue of 86.
that's correct.
Okay.
Right. So on the revenue side, we've broken it down into what I'll identify as some major categories, being property tax. We've created a category called local receipts, all other, which is essentially any of the smaller receipts, not the large ones that we look at typically and break out, being motor vehicle excise, rooms and meals, and licenses and permits. State aid, which probably would generate some questions. Typically, because of the timing of our budget process, state aid is actually not known. We're already gone through town meeting, have already voted a budget by the time the Boston actually, the governor signs the budget bill. So during the 16 budget, we had projected $2.3 million. When the budget was actually adopted in 2016, we're actually getting $3.1 million, which is what we have projected for 17. We're projecting flat. There's been various rumblings that it may increase, but there's also been rumblings with Chapter 70 it may change, so we're keeping it flat, which is what a lot of communities are doing. So that's where that number does come from. On the expenditure side, we've broken it down into 4 departments, one being municipal departments. We've broken down the school department. We've broken down non-departmental, which is our insurances, retirement appropriation, things of that nature. Then special appropriations are everything what I typically could call below the line, so it's the general fund subsidies to the enterprise funds, any of the other articles, be it the human services article, the reserve fund transfer, or reserve fund that we raise, which is in its own article, OPEB, the county budget, things of that nature, or make up that. So that gets us to the $86,843,000. Page 22 is just a slide that breaks down the revenue by categories. As you can see, tax revenue being the largest of all of them at 85%, with both rooms and meals and state aid being 4% of that total. And then permits, licenses and permits 2%, motor vehicle excise 2%, and all the other local receipts being 3%. We then did the same with the expenses based on those same categories that I just discussed and showed what percentage of the 86 million all of those are. So starting on page 24 kind of breaks down some of the larger categories and shows what type of increases we've looked at or department heads have requested and that we've put forward. Starting with town expenses, the current projection in the budget that we will present to you and discuss through the next couple of months is $6.9 million, which is 15% over what we had presented last year, with approximately almost 900,000 of expense increase requests included in that total. Salaries are projected at $17.6 million, with new personnel requests included in that total of $497,000. School expenses are $5.2 million. We did not. I don't have what any of their changes are, so we've only given what we've told them that we would give them and combine that. So, $5.2 million in expenses, and then $21.2 million in salaries at the Nantucket Public Schools.
Brian, maybe just a quick question on the process. All the departments sort of submit their wish list for fiscal 17?
Yes.
And how do you go from wish list to the numbers that you sort of put forward? Is it just negotiation between town manager and the chief of police and the fire department? Or how do you get the number down?
We use a kind of a tiered system like we did with the capital requests. Tier 1 are items that would further a program that has been requested by the Board of Selectmen or is related to a plan or action or is a mandate by a state agency or a local. Tier 2 is a item that we would really need to do soon, if not now, next year. And Tier 3 is generally a nice to have item or an item that we will need to do at some point but could be put off a year or possibly more.
But again, to finally get to whatever number you, as the town manager, put forward, you
We-
sort of, is it like a score, or do you, ultimately, you and Chief Pittman have to say, okay, fine, we can agree on 50,000 instead of 80,000? I mean, I don't, you know,
It's a little bit like that, but it's more town administration saying to the department, you're going to have to live without this or that, and taking into consideration what funding we have available to live within the revenue that
okay, so.
we have.
So you really are the person who, the department or the part of the process that says, well, we only expect 86 million in revenue, and we can't squeeze $95 million of expenses, so we think this is an expense that you ought to.
Yeah.
For that.
Yep, and we look at our goals, the board's goals, the bigger perspective of what needs to be prioritized within the government of the town.
Jim? I wonder if I could follow up on that. Maybe use the BLS and the ALS as an example where, I guess, the basic life service and the advanced life service, where they requested additional training and additional personnel, I guess, and it looked like that was back down. Is this part of the process that you're talking about?
Yes, that's a program that we've been talking about for a number of years now, and the chief came in with a request that was to do the program pretty much all at one time, and we have proposed that that be a phased program because we can't really do it all in the same year if we're going to do other things as well. And we are working on a presentation to the board, which we'll let you know when that's coming up. But that might be a kind of a good example of something that came in as, you know, $1 million whatever, and we can't fund all that in 1 year. Again, if we're going to fund other items that are also priorities within the town. But that is one that we think should move forward sooner rather than later.
So where would that be on the tier system that you?
It'd probably be a tier 1, but not the whole amount all at one time.
Thank you.
On the salaries line, I'm assuming on the personnel EIRs, that represents new hires?
Yes.
Okay, and then built into the town salaries number is, I'm assuming that 90+% of employees are locked into contracts?
They're locked into contractual obligations, correct.
So the 17.6, which includes the 497, is what we're currently paying plus the contractual obligation.
Well,
Yeah,
if we
the
didn't have,
497 being what you guys have agreed, or positions
Right.
that we ought to.
so if we had taken those out, it'd be roughly 17.2 would be current staff plus the obligations.
Okay.
So continuing on, the page 25 breaks out some of the other larger areas of the budget, being health insurance. We have started to break this down into active and retirees, just to show the cost of both of those insurances. At one of the selectmen's meetings, our current health insurance advisor came in and gave a presentation on how we arrived at the 9.5% rate. He's recommending or believes that that's where we need to be. I am in constant contact with him probably once a week or once every other week to see if that is still hopefully trending in a positive direction, being downward. So at this point, he's very confident that 9.5% is where it's going to end up. I'm hoping that it will end up a little bit lower by the end of this process.
You and I have had this conversation before, but have you gone through the retiree list to make sure that we're not continuing to pay for people that are long since retired and passed on, passed along?
You mean no longer actually utilizing the insurance? Yes, we actually do a review of it all the time, the bills to make sure, and so we do that to make sure. And we actually did, as part of the Affordable Care Act, we actually had to do a complete review, which was done by an outside company to ensure that everybody that was on the plan was entitled to be on the plan, and if they weren't, they were removed. And we did. So there were a few, not a lot, but there were some based on that review. And it actually has to be done, I believe, so this year was the baseline, and then every 2 years from that, you do have to do it again as part of the Affordable Care Act. So, but we do it in the interim as well. So, general insurances, based on our insurance advisor's recommendation, we have program 10%. I will tell you, I actually met with him yesterday, based on a request from the chairman of the Board of Selectmen. We are going to, I need to talk to Heidi about this, we are going to be going out to see what the market will offer for the property insurance, which is the largest portion of this and where we believe we'll be able to generate possibly the largest amount of savings. So that is something we are undertaking as well. Right.
I can tell you the rates are down.
I know.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah.
That's personal experience already. A couple of boards I'm on, the rates are down.
Right, and so we're going to go through a process and hopefully try to drive the rate down by forcing them to sharpen their pencils. So that is something we're doing. Debt service is just per the schedule that we have based on the current in-force general obligation bonds outstanding. Retirement, we don't actually have the exact number from the retirement system yet. It should be here. If it's not here, wasn't here today, then it should be here any day now.
That's the contribution to Barnstable?
Right. They've advised that 4.5% is where it'll end up, so that's what we had asked them in probably early November, December. So, and then the enterprise subsidies, which we are projecting to be $7.9 million.
Where, do you have an idea of where those are? So obviously the landfill,
The landfill,
our island home.
our island home, and the landfill mining are the three. And I can actually look it up. I don't remember the individual numbers right off the
So
top
we're
of my
not
head.
anticipating having to do anything with the airport?
No, we're not. We're actually anticipating getting money from them, so. So then we kind of break down what as I mentioned, we're kind of like other below the line of the actual operating budget. The Health and Human Services, last year was $350,000 that was voted at the annual town meeting. The administration is recommending a $50,000 increase to $400,000. County assessment, we are not projecting any change from the 170,201. Reserve fund, we feel comfortable recommending the $500,000 again. Unpaid bills and overlay and other deficits I'll talk about in one moment. Other post-employment benefits, we're recommending the $500,000, which is what we had done last year as well.
Do you know, Brian, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
Do we know what the current estimated future liability on our OPEB is?
I want to say 88.8 million, I believe. It increased about $500,000 in this last valuation. It did not spike horribly, so. Cherry sheet charges, which is state aid offsets for the majority of our charges for the NRTA. The community school, we have recommended at the request of the school department an additional $50,000 from the $350,000 that we have given them annually to $400,000. And then included in this budget is also, as required by the town code, the 1% of prior year local estimated receipt, or prior year of real estate and personal property taxes. So that's $774,000, which is required by the charter and the code.
Mr. Chairman, question. Back to the community school, wasn't that part of the school budget?
No. Well, it's included in Article 8, but we showed it separate. We've shown it separately in this report since I've been here. So okay, right.
Brian, what happens to on the 775, basically 1% of prior year revenue if it's not used? Does it fall to?
Well, it becomes part of articles, so we would either potentially reallocate it or it would go to free cash if it wasn't used for if the projects came in less than they had been anticipated or estimated at.
And typically how much are we using?
Every penny of it.
Post free cash allocation or pre-free? How much of it gets dropped into free cash?
None of it, because it's all separate individual articles that the funding is allocated to, and if the project came in less, it would be a funding source to reallocate, so
you use this money before you use free cash?
We use them in tangent with each other to fund the entire capital project program. Some of the projects that get recommended would be the funding source from there. So unpaid bills and overlay and other deficits are actually left zero because at this point we're not projecting any. Overlay and other deficits typically are anything that are not, well, the only other deficit allowable by law is snow and ice, and we're hoping that we won't have anything. That certainly could change. So.
Is this year coming up here, is that a reassessment year for property tax?
2016 was a reval year.
Well, you
So the year that we did was the revaluation year, yes. So the last slide before I turn this back over to the town manager just was something that I was asked to put together. Essentially just breaks down active and retirees for health insurance we went back to 2011 through 2015 in actuals. And just to let you know, what we did is, we're doing a little bit better analysis of it, but it basically is a 75 or 74, 26 split is the way this has been allocated. So it's not pure one for one. That is something that we are actually working on to get the actual split, but that's typically where it has resided in my experience.
In the proposed 2017 health insurance, the Cadillac tax is not reflected there?
It is not, and actually in the budget document and budget agreement that was recently passed, they actually delayed it for 2 more years to 2020, before it will be actually be required to be implemented. So I'll jump off at this point.
We had about 2.4 million in submitted requests from the departments. We're recommending about 1.6 million. Of the 1.6 million, there are approximately 300,000 in one-time requests, and the rest are ongoing, and we would fund those through a variety of funding sources, as shown there, the tax levy, budget adjustments, potential revenue increases, although that's not actually factored in right at the moment, free cash, other items shown there. This is a breakdown of exactly where the funding sources would fall into place for these additional requests. The tax levy and other general revenues would fund 1.2 million. Free cash funds a one-time capital item of 72,000, and then other funds coming up would fund the remainder. Those other funds are shown here. Using the Cape and Islands license plate fund for our fast ferry connector item, the beach revolver, that would be for replacement ATVs for the beach patrol program. The waterways fund would fund town pier, a portion of the town pier maintenance. The ambulance reserve fund would fund thank you, an upgrade to the ambulances for ALS. And the sewer enterprise fund would fund an actual position that we intend to create to oversee the sewer enterprise fund and the sewer program. The next slide is just sort of trying to tie together the additional expenses and how they relate to goals and priorities of the board and town administration. I won't go through all of them individually, but they're all pretty much listed here. We are generally directed to present a balanced budget, which we've done. We're trying to invest more in our infrastructure. We definitely have some staffing issues with seasonal and increased service demands. Water quality is a big issue. Health insurance, obviously, we're going to be talking with the board about a strategic plan. Housing's an issue. And the other items listed.
There doesn't seem to be an appetite to do anything with the reserve fund, or at least in a big way, as far as building it up and so forth.
A reserve fund? You mean?
Capital?
Do you mean the Capital Project Stabilization Fund? We're actually at the moment requesting or recommending a $500,000 allocation to that fund. Sorry, 250.
I just noticed there wasn't one of these, it wasn't on this list.
It's just a different budget item.
Yeah, it also is a mental priority or not. And apparently, I look at this and say it's probably not, it doesn't look like it's much of a priority.
Well, I didn't list every single goal and priority that anybody's ever come up with on the sheet. I tried to just do the major ones. And that, based on last year's action, seemed to be more of a priority to bring forward to people last year, since it was the first year we funded that fund. And so this year we're proposing to continue it on a bit of a lesser scale. Last year was $1 million.
Yeah, last year's $1 million, this year's $5 million.
But continue it on a little bit. But I didn't really call it out here. No.
Okay.
That doesn't mean it's not important.
It's a continuation, it's not a change in policy or direction.
Exactly.
Just to follow up, you plan on submitting a warrant article for that 250,000 for
We have a warrant article in place, and it would be your motion as to the number. Right now, in our budget, the number is 250. The next page are some specifics, just kind of getting down from the big to the more detailed. And our requests would do the items that are listed on here: improve facilities, infrastructure, equipment maintenance, address the staffing issues, the water quality issues, substance abuse prevention potentially with the increase in health and human services, funding, housing, and the energy initiatives. We have a slide here to show, these are items that we really do as a matter of course to reduce expenses and or increase efficiency or transparency. And I think this is probably, we had a similar slide last year. Whenever a key position becomes vacant, we review the job description, whether or not it's needed, whether or not we can combine it with something else, whether or not the salary is appropriate, whether or not we can potentially get it in or out of a union, combining and consolidating duties where appropriate, cross-training. We're trying really hard to get a lot more of our staff trained as certified Massachusetts public purchasing officials so that a number of people can do procurement, not just one person. We are always reviewing our internal controls and trying to find ways to implement software to better inform the public, track activities, monitor projects, things like that. And some of the items listed there are items that we've been working on with software, capital being a most recent one, complaint tracking, budget project management, and a couple of things that aren't on here, but which we do on a regular basis are, some of you are probably familiar with the WPI projects. Worcester Polytech Institute sends students here annually now, and there's several groups of them that do different projects for the town and other organizations. They did a few for us this year, and some of that can be really helpful. We also recently entered into what's called a community compact with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is a program that the state rolled out earlier this year, and they will provide technical assistance financially and otherwise for a particular best management practice that you'd want to implement. We put forward the revision of our financial policies. So they, and what it does for you, if you get accepted into the program, it can put you on a higher list for grant opportunities. So we've been accepted, and we're going to, we just yesterday sent them our scope, and we'll procure someone to do our financial policy review, and those will all come to you at some point.
Libby, does the e-permitting come under this heading, or is that something else? Is that a different?
That's sort of an ongoing item, and that has stalled a bit because our vendor did not function as we had hoped. So we are in the process now of seeking a new vendor. We're nearing the end of some demos from the various vendors, and hopefully we'll get that underway. But we do have an amount of money in the fiscal 17 budget to fund that. I probably should have put it on here. That was a good point.
Libby, just curious, the complaint tracking, is that voters or town employees?
That's a citizens,
Okay.
pretty much, that would either call something in, or even if an employee noticed something, a violation of some kind. The idea is that we would use some software to, somebody inputs the complaint, and then all the departments can look at it, and whenever there's an action taken, it gets recorded so we can see at all times where it is in the process.
That's pretty cool. Thank you. And how is C-Quick Fix work?
C-Click Fix is over. There is no longer the support for C-Click Fix from that vendor, and we're moving into a different sort of system which ultimately will be able to offer a very similar service as C-Click Fix. It's called People GIS, and it's just been acquired fairly recently by the DPW. There are a number of modules with it, and a complaint kind of a module. I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's similar to C-Click Fix, where somebody can, it probably has an app to it, and it'll be similar, but C-Click Fix was kind of all over the place, and it was hard to get back to people with what had happened. So it was a good start, but we're going to move into something a little more functional.
Thank you.
some other recommendations that may or may not be in the budget, may or may not end up in the budget. We're recommending that we enter into a strategic planning process with the board. We do need board support for that, and we don't know exactly how much something like that would cost. We're not sure exactly what approach the board would want to take. So right now, our recommendation is that, and also we have a lot of other projects going on right now. The recommendation is that in the spring, the board would have a workshop or 2 or 5 to figure out what they want their approach to be to strategic planning. And we could get together some cost estimates as to what, depending on the approach they want to take, what kind of facilitation would there be and that sort of thing. We may or may not be able to fund that with existing funds in this fiscal 17 budget, or maybe even 16, depending on what kind of money we're talking about. And if it's beyond those budgets, then we would seek an appropriation in the fiscal 18 budget.
Just a comment, remind the committee that at our orientation in our first meeting, we talked a lot about the challenges we face as a committee of making recommendations for the expenditure of funds in the absence of a strategic plan. We had a couple of members of the board of selectmen here. I think we got the town manager, who agree with us on both happy to see this, and I hope we have some small part to play in that, and if we can continue to do so, let us know.
Very well. We may include maybe a small group of you in our process as well, so thank you for that support. Staffing and resource assessment. We have never done a comprehensive review of our staffing and resources and whether or not they're sufficient to address the community growth and service needs. So something like that can be somewhat costly, and you have to be careful about who you pick to do it, because they really need to focus entirely on your committee. There's a lot of interviews, there's a lot of maybe surveying, there's a lot of discussion with internal people about what you're doing and what you think you need, and outside people, the same thing. So something like this would feed into our strategic plan, I think. I've talked to a couple of other managers about it, and we're probably talking, in the $100,000 range for something like this. So it's not in our fiscal 17 budget, but it's something we want to discuss when we're getting into the strategic plan discussion. Our Island Home. We've been talking at the board level about the potential of an operating override to address the funding of our Island Home and maybe relieve the general fund budget a little bit of the subsidy, the annual subsidy. Last night at our meeting, the board pretty much said, let's not do that right now. Let's get through more of our review of operational models for the Island Home first, and see what we may or may not need there going forward. So it's a bit premature. But I think they understand that something's going to have to be done with that expense.
I just a quick comment. I'm not sure. I don't think we're going to ask any questions of department heads today. I think so.
Oh, sure.
You all don't need that.
You guys can be released if you want. Thank you.
On this staffing and resource assessment, a few times I've done it in my past, but one of the things we found, probably at the last time I did it, and wished I had done it before, was starting out with a table of organization and really doing it like, and then bringing people in and saying, is this what you think you have? And trying to match up individuals with things.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
That started, that opened a lot of eyes several times.
Yeah. The next slide, Brian can take us through if need be. It's just, this went along with the Island Home override discussion and what their retained earnings and projected retained earnings are going forward. The use of the retained earnings for the Island Home for operational purposes is increasing, which was one of the things that prompted our discussion with the board about operational override, because the more they're relying on their retained earnings, the less they're going to have.
Just, I don't, it doesn't have to be long, but how does an entity that loses $2 to $3 million a year have any retained earnings at all?
Well, that's a good question, Brian.
It's a question, but it's like, why aren't these negative numbers? Is I guess
Well, they're not negative numbers because when they calculate retained earnings, the subsidy is calculated. You're backing the subsidy out when you're saying they lose $3 million, $2.7 million, when we present to the state for certified retained earnings, there's a subsidy that's there, so that's why they generate. And the primary driver of their retained earnings right now is this money that we get back. I believe we're only one of 2 entities in the state that get it back. It's known as CPE, or Certified Public Expenditure Money, and it ranges from it's roughly about $1.2 million a year, give or take. That is the primary driver of the retained earnings for their Ireland home. If that went away, then they would basically have no retained earnings. So that's why they're generating those retained earnings. I understand what you're saying, but that's how the state views it. So.
Well, no, I appreciate it. This is sort of after the town contributes to subsidies.
That's correct.
I was just going to say, why aren't we, I mean, it would seem to me that we would be spending down the reimbursements from the state, so our retained earnings would in fact be, would only represent the subsidy that was coming from the town.
Well, retained earnings are used every year, but we don't budget that subsidy on an annualized basis because of its.
I know you don't budget it,
right.
But it's come in a prior year, so it goes into the current, whatever year it comes in, it goes into.
It will go into, so the one that we just received will be certified for July 1st of 2016 for appropriation for 18. You have to remember that you can't use the current year surplus revenue until it's certified, and then it's not available. Then you could appropriate it at any other town meeting after that point. So it could be appropriated for 17 or 18 once this is certified.
So aside from the lag,
Mm-hmm.
I would think that we would be using it rather than going.
Well, we are every year, so this is just a creation in the following year. So in this year's budget, we used $1.5 million to balance the budget, and we're projecting that we'll generate this 2016 was actually what was certified. So 17, we're projecting that when we certify it, will be on July 1st, it'll be $1.4 million.
Some outstanding items or current unknowns, and some of this is a bit older now, but no, maybe not entirely. There are 2 citizen warrant articles that have been submitted for $150,000 each. Those are not funded right now in our budget recommendation. We don't have our Chapter 90 number yet. Sorry.
Fire station in Wisconsin.
Fire station in Wisconsin and.
So you're taking all the citizen warrant articles and they don't have a funding source?
The citizen warrant articles right now that do not have a funding source now.
Okay, so
We have not included them. They total 300,000. Yep.
but that doesn't mean, okay, so
Gives you a target.
no, but I mean, we haven't even opined on whether those are citizen articles that we.
Exactly. So we're not putting them in our budget at all right now. Chapter 90 is something you probably are aware of. It's roadway money that comes to every city and town in the Commonwealth, and we don't know what that number is yet for fiscal 17. It was around $600,000 or $700,000 for 15. The general fund subsidy to Ireland Home, the override. So we kind of know now we're not doing that. The state aid impact. Right now, we just don't know in the state budget process what cities and towns are going to get for state aid, but I think we have a pretty conservative number built into our budget. And expiring contracts, these are things like our cleaning contract expires, the concessions expire all sort of mid-fiscal 17 or during some period of time. So we have numbers in, but we don't know exactly what they'll be yet.
Libby, on that Chapter 90, in a way, in a very subtle way, I think you kind of do look at that, and that's part of the planning process, I think, if I'm not mistaken, because you know you're going to get something, and you know that you're going to allocate it to certain streets and certain things like that. So in a way, you kind of are considering that, even though it's not in the budget.
Well, we just don't know the exact number.
Yeah.
But yes, you're right. We kind of have a number in our heads about what it'll be, so that if we think it's around $600,000 or $700,000, and our roadway maintenance plan calls for $1 million, we're probably not going to appropriate $1 million.
Exactly, yes, okay.
That's generally how we try to work it.
Yep.
Oh, cool, okay. Well, yeah, is it going to burst into flame? If it's,
The lamp in the camera.
if it's not going to burst into flame, maybe we can just keep going. Yeah, you can just get a fire extinguisher. Is it really bad? Yeah, okay. Yeah, he left.
Trying to find out what's
I'm hiding behind Craig anyway.
Okay, just settle, staff. The preliminary free cash recommendations, I think these aren't, necessarily 100% final yet, because you all haven't really reviewed it yet. But right at the moment, the general fund free cash was certified at 5.4 million. We used 2.3 at the special town meeting. And we would propose that we use the rest of it as follows. We'd have our one-time request that I mentioned earlier. This is where the capital project stabilization fund would be funded from, and the rest would fund town and school capital. The next couple of slides, you've already gone through.
Just a comment on
Oh, sure.
this school district that it's brings joy to my heart that we have free cash and we have this plan laid out at this time of the year.
Thank you, Brian. And Linnell. The next page, couple pages, is are the actual capital requests that have been submitted. You guys already have reviewed those, so I don't know that we need to go through them right now, but they were just listed in here at the time for the board meeting. We have a chart. Oops. Sorry, let's go on for a little bit. Next steps now, some of this has already obviously happened now, but the capital program committee had their review with you on December 15th. We went to the school committee on that date as well. We had our public hearing last night. The board has endorsed our recommendations for the budget. We're here today with you, and we're reviewing enterprise fund budget with the board. They're scheduled for the 20th, but that's probably going to be spread over a couple of meetings, not everything at one meeting, which I didn't really think about at the time we were putting this together. And then between now and mid-March, you all are reviewing the various budgets and the other financial appropriations, all leading up to the 2016 annual town meeting on Saturday, April 2nd. The next bunch of slides, I think, are just charts to illustrate differences between prior and proposed projected fiscal year. And I won't take you through all those. You can look at those later. Just I just want to point out that I think in your packet we developed a budget narrative or a message. We keep calling it the narrative, but it's really more of a message. We looked at some other towns' formats that they use for this and kind of cobbled together some different ones that components that we liked. So that's in there, and the summary of expense increase requests I think is in there, and there's a lot of attachments that are related to what is in the budget message, things like what's the stabilization fund, what is free cash, all of that we tried to make it easy, more for citizens who might be interested to go back and look at what the sort of supporting documents are.
I thought that was very good, by the way, when I
Good, thank you.
I just,
Great,
good job.
thanks.
I thought it was good too. One thing that caught my attention was the pilots program. Could you explain that, and who would be a typical pilot?
There's only one pilot. It's the Nantucket Housing Authority. So a pilot program would be a payment in lieu of taxes, and it's a voluntary system. There are probably a number of nonprofit groups on the island that don't pay property tax because of what they're classified as, but use town services. So we've not really ever gone down the road of trying to negotiate pilots with any of them. It's come up recently throughout the state as a way in which municipalities could perhaps recover some amount of funds to help out their budgets. We're not quite in the same situation as many of the other towns that have been trying to do that. But again, it's voluntary, so there's not there's no requirement for it. We just have the one, I think the Housing Authority pays around $4,000 or so, $7,300 annually. And they're somewhat of a state agency, so it's a little easy.
So what would be an example of other pilots on island who would qualify for this?
The hospital would be one. I don't think the Athenaeum pays property tax. NHA perhaps could be one. We have a pretty thick list of the groups. I don't think we have it in the appendix. We didn't put it in the appendix, but if you want to look at it, we have it available. We could give you a link or something to it.
It's commonly, in other parts of the country, it's commonly for the commercial enterprises that generate revenue greater than expense that are owned by these 501c3s.
And universities and colleges are often
And also,
really.
I know I think in Boston, it's widely used.
Yep,
They're in a voluntary way.
exactly.
Just a quick question for Brian. You mentioned this somewhere along earlier in your presentation. I made a note for page 49, the issue about the airport paying the town back some of the lent money. Right now, we don't think the Island Air bankruptcy is going to have enough of an impact on the airport to change that expectation?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, but I know that they have budgeted money in the 16 budget, and there is money will be in the 17 budget. We are finalizing the MOU, so there will be an agreement. It does, obviously, within it would give the selectmen and the airport commission the ability to decide if something happened, such as what you're referencing, and they thought they needed to defer it a little bit. That's would be something that's in there, but. As far Tom is working extremely hard, and I have a meeting with him next Tuesday to kind of get an update on where that's at. So right now, I haven't gotten an indication that they're not going to make the payment, so I'm holding out hope.
They're developing contingency plans.
Right.
You know, what their costs and areas.
And it's-
And it's not only just the lease payment. I think the leases wasn't that great, but it's
Yeah, the PFC, the passenger facility charge. Also, just,
I'm sorry, Libby. And assuming they do pay the money back, where does this go into free cash, or what happens to the return funds?
It would simply go into as general fund revenues and then be certified as free cash and available to spend in the subsequent year.
Okay, yeah.
Excuse me, we got a fire or something going in here. It's starting to get hazy. We need to get up and look. We think it's the projector.
So should we move downstairs?
Oh, it's open.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, or you can just take a 5-minute break and we can look this.
That's up to you.
Can you do it while we're talking?
It is getting a little hazy, actually. I thought that was just me.
We'll offer advice.
Oh, gosh. Jim, but Brian, I read in the newspaper, it said something like it was going to take a hit of about $500,000.
Can I tweet this out?
And I don't know.
What?
So, any other questions? Libby, does that conclude your presentation?
yes,
Okay,
thank you.
very good.
Jim, I just wanted to, Brian, when I read in the newspaper, they were going to take a hit of 500. I would find what little I know about their budget in the past and going forward, that would be a problem. Unless that number is really not a good number.
I think it would be difficult for me to comment right now, given the fact that I've actually not had a chance to sit down and fully understand what the airport's plans are right now to know. So I know what I did read the same thing in the paper, but I've had very brief conversations, and I know they're working hard to mitigate it. And I think that a follow-up article said that there may be new air service as well. So I think there's still some analysis to be done before the 500 would be what is certainly going to happen. So.
My recollection is there were
Premature.
lease payment is 475, somewhere ahead of my head from whatever their spaces are. Any other questions? Again, I compliment you on a great presentation, especially like the transparency and participation. I think this will really help the boards as well as we go through our kind of review and recommendation. And it's really, I think I'm hoping that, I know I will be mindful of the elements of this plan and also the budget message as we go through. So I think it should streamline some of our discussions. Thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is to chat about citizen warrant articles. We're at a point where we can begin to give or take some direction, make some direction, take votes on them, and that would give some direction to Wendy and others to craft motions. And I thought we would just go through them one by one. I think we were going to do maybe caused all our problems. But now very graciously made copies of them. We'll just start going one by one. And maybe if it's a complicated one, we can refer it. But I just, my plan to use by 6 o'clock. So the first one.
Didn't we agree on zoning? We were going to hang until
The real estate committee,
both the real estate committee as well as to planning board.
I thought so.
We'll skip over all the zoning ones. And so that leaves us with Woodbine, and I think those were also.
Those were part of the,
They were part of it. Town charter amendment for town clerk. This is
Gotta recuse myself in this one.
the charter amendment. This would be, what is this,
This is the change from elected to appointed.
okay, right, okay, so, anybody's thoughts? You said you have to recuse yourself.
I'm the proposer.
Oh, okay.
But I'll give you my opinion if you want.
So, any comments, questions? Anybody have is there a sense of the group?
I personally like the idea of going to an appointed position here. It seems like we're on a mission to try to get everybody to function in a more cohesive fashion. And it doesn't have an impact upon,
Operations.
well, on the current town clerk minutes.
And this week appointed by the town administration or for board of selectmen.
The way it's written,
Board of selectmen, right?
Board of Selectmen,
Well, I'm sort of sympathetic to Catherine's separation. I'm not sure that we're going to have the Board of Selectmen going down to the voting booths telling people, telling the town clerk how to vote people or take ballots or.
It gets everyone to be focused on the direction that the town, to have one, especially in light of we have a strategic plan, I think that's one of the advantages.
Yeah.
John?
Yeah, I would agree with David, maybe even more vehemently, because, we've seen over the years, I've seen, and we all have seen, that's been here, one year, there's always something that the town clerk is bringing up to circumvent town administration.
Certainly in the capital request.
Yeah. Well, so, and to me, that's always been irritated, but, I always thought, well, we don't have a real choice, that's the way it is. But I listened very carefully to the arguments that were made against this, and all I I didn't hear of anything that wasn't self-serving. Okay, now maybe I'm missing something, and I didn't.
But we all know that, even though we, for many years, we turned back the, was it the shelving? Was that it?
Yes,
Didn't that
shelving.
finally get approved by us because we got, or by town meeting?
Right, it got recommended by us and then was approved at town meeting. But this article wouldn't affect the current job holder.
No.
So that criticism, John, sounds like it's of the individual and not of
Yes,
how the machine works.
No.
You know, we're fixing a machine. I'm not against this, by the way. I'm just saying that maybe that point isn't relevant because it doesn't. This article, if it passes, wouldn't affect this person. So,
yeah, I understand.
I mean, whether this person had the job because she was appointed or elected, she could still come back here. I mean, she could come back and ask for new shelving next year.
Really? Could they do that?
Not if she was part of administration.
No, but she wouldn't be.
But an employee of the police department came here and asked for money this year and last year, and I think at special town meeting, I mean, for various things. I mean, town employees, no matter how they get their job, are also citizens, and they can ask for whatever they want.
Right, but, often for citizen articles, but, you know, like the funeral home and that kind of stuff, those things, but, did she?
I mean, I think we-
Articles that related to the town clerk's office, maybe she did.
I think we have to separate out the person from whether this is a policy that we think is a good policy going forward. It's written, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, but it doesn't have any impact upon the current incumbent.
Not at all.
So,
I mean, other than if I may speak, I suppose, in and out. I mean, my intention here, my hope here is that all we really end up doing is having the town clerk's department or office become part of town administration, like every other service we provide to the citizens of this island. And you don't have this outlier who can operate, outside of the whole budgeting and management process the town has set up.
But does this fix that? I mean, to my point, can't this person, even if you're part of town administration, can't they bring a citizen warrant article and ask for funds for any purpose?
Regarding their office?
Sure. I mean, for any purpose.
Libby, do you have a?
No, town employees are really pretty much told, don't go. You're not really allowed to submit a warrant article for funding for something to do with your department or to do with the town.
But wasn't Catherine told don't do this also?
Yes, but she's elected, so I don't have any control over whether she doesn't do it or not.
Do you think this would stop that process?
If the town clerk position were appointed, yes, that person would not be able to.
So this would be cause, maybe, so you could say, if you did that, and I told you not to do it, now maybe you wouldn't be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we should have a different working relationship.
Right,
Be a
right.
very different working.
Yeah.
Be a collaborative, it would be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and we have precedent. When did we stop electing our town finance director?
The finance director was never elected, but the treasurer was, and the collector was, and that was probably in the mid to late 80s.
Yeah. And we stopped doing that without any deleterious effect on.
Is there anybody who objects to this? They want to raise?
Point of order, I think it was 10 years ago where the Board of Selectmen tried to do a lot more appointing than electing, and it was a pushback from town meeting. Because they just feel like you're taking that much more power away from the voter, and they'd rather vote who's in it.
And we can expect that to happen.
oh, I don't know.
A lot of that's happened.
Yeah, this isn't gonna make it, but I'm just saying. It's it's sort of an aggravating thing. What you're trying to do is you're trying to develop something here that will function better. And this has been a source of aggravation for a long time.
So is it a sense of the committee to move forward with a motion to recommend this article? Anybody, I guess we don't take a motion to that effect? Anybody want to make that motion?
Unless we want to.
Pardon?
Is there any reason to continue to discuss it in 3 weeks?
I don't think so. No, we can start taking action. But just to give Libby a direction on how to write the motion.
Yeah, I'm willing to make a motion.
Okay, is there a second?
Aye.
Any further discussion? Just a comment that we would be supporting the citizen warrant article? Is that how we make the motion?
Your motion on this would be, pretty much as it's written here, move that the charter be amended, blah, 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 and we use all the same wording.
And in a comment, we could talk about the things
Could you do a comment?
or, create, I don't know, improve working relationships, more transparency, in line with, I don't know, what we can.
I think, didn't Joe, you make the point there's a trend across the state?
There certainly seems to be a trend in the Commonwealth that towns are converting from elected to appointed, and that it,
30%. It's less than half.
oh yeah, there's still a majority that are elected.
Yeah,
There's
I
not
think in our comment, we could make a more compelling argument than that. I think there's a good argument to make, but not probably that.
Any other ideas about a comment, elements of a comment? Okay, is that enough to work on?
Sure, I can try to work with that.
No, we're all gonna, put hands down, we're gonna agree to do this, right?
We're jumping together.
Right, any further discussion? All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed, no, so that's unanimous. Home rule petitions, amendment of the town charter. Oh, this is term limits, yes, we're all excited. Okay, so what are your, this is again a policy decision? I personally agree with the idea of this.
Which one are you on, Jim?
This is the term limits.
Term limits?
Constant.
Gotcha.
And, even though it would affect me personally, I think it may be a good idea. Although I know we've discussed at Finance Committee that we think it takes a little longer here to know that certainly 9 years should be. Anyway, I don't mean to editorialize, but that's my comments or questions about this one.
I personally am very much in support of it. I think it's, I don't know what the trend is around the Commonwealth for term limits on some of this stuff. It's probably all over the place. But I think as Bob made in his comments, it's not unusual if you go on boards to be termed out, sit on the sidelines for a year, come back in. I don't think it limits, but it also encourages turnover. Because I do believe there are people that would like to participate that.
Who don't want to run against them. John?
Yeah, speaking of someone who will be affected by this, I support it very strongly. I think that, again, somehow it's a good idea if we can get more people involved in government, and when you have the same old, we've got to find mechanisms, but this will force that, I think, because as long as you can always rely on good old Joe over here, nothing, who can, then there's no one seems to have a strong need to go out and find people who can.
Also, I think it also disperses the power, so because if you tend to have the same people in a power position, a few people, then you only have to talk to one or two people to get things done, and it keeps a lot of people in the dark, and that's, maybe that's too crass, but.
I just had a question about this. The way this is written in the last sentence, a person who's been prohibited may be reelected or appointed after 1 year has elapsed from the ending date of his or her previous service on the board. It sounds like you may have to sit out more than 1 year because the appointments aren't.
Person has been prohibited from serving on
No.
Well, you can't be appointed until 1 year has elapsed from the last time that you've been on. So appointments are made before the beginning of terms.
He said, it says from serving.
Right, but you can't
Okay,
be,
maybe reelected after 1 year has elapsed, so you could be.
so if appointments are made in April for a June start, and you stop, say, June 15th, you couldn't be reappointed the following April. So you'd have to sit out 2 years.
No.
I don't think
Yeah, I
that's-
don't
think so.
Aren't
I mean,
the
look-
ending
look
and
at our
beginning dates are the
terms.
same,
Yeah,
so you can
no,
skip
okay,
it.
let's look at
No,
our terms.
but, you know, so the appointments are made in late June for July 1 fiscal year.
Year.
Right.
So if somebody's out for a year, and they're gonna be appointed, in June, they won't have served out a year, they won't have.
That's what I'm saying. It'll be, a few weeks less than a full
At
year.
the
No,
time
but-
of appointment, they wouldn't have been out.
But you're not appointed officially appointed until the 1st of July. That's when your term starts.
Right.
What says reelected or
Right.
Yeah,
reelected?
reelected
Just
or
like re-election.
reappointed. I mean,
But
I
I mean,
get the
but-
intention. I just want to make
No,
sure
no,
what we
yeah, I-
do is exactly what we think we're doing.
And I think that's what Bobby intended, that you sit out a year, but you could be. if
I mean, our term ends on the 30 days, that's it, June,
Right.
29th or 30th of June.
Right.
The new term starts on the 1st of July, so you're out on the 30th, you're out for a year. Sometime in May, you put in your name again.
Right.
The board does an appointment, but those appointments aren't effective until the 1st of July,
Which I
would,
think makes sense, and that's what I
If
want
that's
to,
what- As long as that's what.
as long as that's what this says, because it says you can't be appointed until you've sat out a year. Not that you can't be appointed
And
until
those
a
are
term that
listed on
starts
the
next year.
Board of Selectmen as finance committee appointments, and they're voted on on a date prior to July.
Right.
So maybe that's a question for town.
I think it's just as you're saying.
Pardon me?
I think it's just as you're saying.
Just as I said.
You're saying it right.
Correct.
You're saying that you get, even though you get reappointed on
Yeah,
May 27th by the Board of Selectmen, your appointment is effective July 1.
right. You're not really reappointed then. You're going to be, you're,
But you're not reappointed on the first date of your term, I don't think.
So
I
why
mean,
don't you
the
just
tech-
ask town council for a
Okay.
clarification on that?
Just to make sure.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. But on the, so we want to take action on this? I think we could always, assuming that's the,
Yeah, we could always revisit it later if we find out different, but
is there a motion to approve this?
Yeah, Peter had a question.
I have a question. What happens if there's no one to be elected or to be appointed? For that vacancy? Do we just go with that?
That happens often.
Then
We have
nobody-
a number- We have boards that, and then we go out.
No light on the board.
But they have another, like a way.
Is there ever a quorum problem?
depending on what it is.
Do like a historical, I don't know, but some of the.
You could have one.
I'd hate to see you meet on a great issue.
Any other questions?
I think just to reiterate the point that was made when we discussed it previously, that a person who was opposed to this said there's institutional knowledge that those people contain that should stay on the board, which I'm not sure I agree with. I think, there is a learning curve, but I don't think it's something that's insurmountable.
And the institutional, if the institutional knowledge is only within one member, then I think that speaks volumes to the committee, and the institutional knowledge should be imbued in each member. Absolutely.
That gets back to the selection process, and that's what's very important. And that's why I think this in a very indirect way, forces the selection process to be a little more rigorous, because you can't count on that one person. Where now I can just see people saying, well, let's put good old Joe over there because so-and-so will keep things straight,
Now, I can't remember, are HDC Joe's elected, or?
They are.
So how does this trump the election of an HDC?
Mhm. This would apply to them.
This would trump that, okay, this would.
Apply to a selectman?
Elected or appointed.
Elected or appointed, it applies to.
I'd like to reply. Great. So we take a motion? Is there a motion?
So moved.
Joe, second?
Second.
John? All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
No, so it's unanimous.
So,
Oh, hi. Yes, good, welcome back. So, would you remind us of your name?
I'm Michelle Whalen, I'm the vice chair of the Agricultural Commission.
I think the issue here was agricultural tourism. Tourism.
Agritourism.
Agritourism. So this
Unintended consequences.
conversations outside the meeting, and I know there was some checking that you didn't go on, and I don't know what the status of all that is. So anybody want to make a comment or a question?
Yes.
Then please include yourself on that.
Didn't we ask town council to look at this to make sure, because what we were hearing at the last was that this isn't going to change anything. It's just going to put teeth into it of our existence. And I think that was fine, but we
I thought we did too, but then I asked somebody else if we did, and they said no, so I don't know.
Well, I had it in a note.
Okay, good. All
So
right,
we
so
asked
it wasn't just.
town council to do that, just to look at it and make sure.
If we got anything from him?
No,
No.
I'm not sure he knew he was supposed to do something. What
no,
was it
he
again?
sent something.
Yeah,
Oh, he did?
Oh, a long time ago.
He did.
Yeah.
He represents Salisbury.
Yeah, he represents Salisbury, and that was the question that I had.
It was ZBA, right?
Yeah,
And what did he say?
that basically the zoning trumps the farm home rule petition for right to farm.
Does that make, I know you raised the question.
Well, I mean, that was certainly one of the issues that I had, but a broader issue, and it really goes more to, this requires the real estate community to notify people on every change of ownership on a parcel. And it strikes me, and I addressed it to the agricultural committee, that you're going to go to town meeting and you're without any real discussion about this in the community. And it just strikes me that we're embarking upon, or proposing to embark upon, changes that nobody really knows a whole lot about. And I guess from it just strikes me that you guys ought to be, if you're, first of all, this is an individual's petition. It didn't come out of the agricultural committee, although I understand everybody sort of supports it. And we're now so we are proposing these changes, of which some require notification of the real estate, on transactions. It just said it's going to affect the real estate community.
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear about that affecting the real estate community, because we had talked about it coming through the tax collector, when coming through the town office, that would normally be sent stuff out.
Understood, but I think the way it's written, there has to be a notification.
Some notification.
Yes, and so I'll turn to my colleague to my right here, who's in the real estate community. It would seem to me that he now would have an affirmative responsibility to tell a buyer that Nantucket is now a right to farm community, and these are the potential issues that, or the potential things that could take place on an adjacent property to theirs. And I don't have a problem with that, other than the fact that we don't seem to be having a community discussion about whether this is something that we want to do. It looks like it's going to go to town meeting, and that's where the discussion will take place. And it just seems like that's not the appropriate way to put in place an island-wide change and follow that process. So if it makes sense, then, I would urge the agricultural committee to get out there and, get some community meetings going and have a discussion, so that it isn't going to be, the 9 of us making a decision about whether to endorse this or not, that there's feedback that's come from the community that helps inform our decision.
Is it my understanding that this is just an affirmation of existing laws? I hear you, I understand what you're saying, and I'm happy to take that back to the commission as your feedback. But currently, as the way the law works, the whole state is a right to farm state. And we're just saying, yay for farming. I mean, that's essentially what you're doing by endorsing this.
Yeah,
There's
David,
no
I
change.
shared those concerns as a real estate broker with you until the last time we spoke about this, and clarification was made that all of these rights and I guess rights is the only word for it, you know, that somebody can farm and they can, you know, make noise and they can make smells and they can do all these things. And I was concerned about that, pretty seriously concerned about it, until I learned that it had to be a commercial enterprise and it had to have been in existence, making, it's a fairly low threshold, but some amount of money for at least 2 years, I think.
Yeah, it's 2 years.
So immediately you can object if somebody next to you starts raising alpacas or wants to grow corn or whatever else they might be doing. It's not that on Equator Drive somebody can open, you know, a mini farm and there's nothing you can do about it because it's right to farm. You have, you know, 24 months, and maybe 36 months, where you can raise red flags and say, hey, this is a zoning violation. Also, if you forget, if you're out of town for 3 years or 2 years, whatever the amount of time is, zoning still trumps everything else. So I'm not so concerned about this. This is, you know, affecting people in the Shimo area, if you're near Slozix, if it's affecting people in the Bartlett Farm area, anywhere where there's already an established commercial enterprise. But it's not giving more rights. Frankly, I'm not sure what this does. I mean, it's raising attention that we all like farming, but it really doesn't give anybody more rights than they already have. So
Almost.
It raises awareness. So basically what it does is when you move into the town, it's sort of like, well, this is a community that supports agriculture and
Right.
wants to keep its agricultural
yeah,
enterprises.
I mean, I'm in support of it. It's a feel-good thing. It does, you know, professionally as a broker, I'm not worried about it. Personally, I think, you know, farming's great. I prefer not to live next to a farm, but this doesn't say I have to do that. So.
Other questions?
That's your personal preference.
I know. I moved there because of that. Any other comments? So, David, did that answer your concern or perhaps not?
Well, I'm looking to see where the 24 or 36 months, I mean, it sounds like, you know, that a business has to operate. Is that what you're saying? The business has to operate for 24
the
months?
The business has to operate. That came from town council. Nothing is listed here, but
Nor need it.
right. But the actual right to continue making smells and noises and farm all times of night, that requires that you've been a commercial enterprise for some length of time. You have to make $1,000 a year, or some low amount of money, but the length of time is long.
Yeah, it's in the state's definition of agriculture.
Anybody would like to make a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I have a question.
Yeah.
Actually, under this, it says near the end, in addition to the above, under section 4 that David was talking about, in addition to the above, a copy of this disclosure notification shall be provided by the town to landowners each fiscal year by mail. Who's paying for the mailing? Because we have not, we haven't planned that in the budget, so if it got adopted and endorsed, we'd be obligated to do this under this, and I don't know who's going to pay for it.
We looked at what other towns do,
Mhm.
and they usually just include a line on a mailing that exists. So it's to people who own homes, which they're gonna send their tax documents to.
Right, but
So
the
it would be something they do.
including in the tax bill is only authorized by the collector. There's no other person that can put it in there unless it's the unless the collector authorizes it. And
That's just what they did in other towns.
Okay.
So, you know, there's other ways to do it.
Who puts that?
They had the agricultural commission printed up their own little pamphlet, and
Okay.
then that was included in the envelope. I mean, that's how
Okay.
it is in other places.
Who puts the strip of paper in the tax bill requesting funds for the town scholarship fund?
well, we do. I mean, the collector has authorized that, but we're not, any authorization can't change the cost of the mailing. So if we have other things that she's, and I don't know how many we do, to be quite honest, but it's just a question that, you know, who is paying for it, if in fact it has to be done.
Sounds like
That-
there's a workaround.
And there very well could be, I just,
Doesn't
okay.
Any other?
Has the Board of Selectmen had a discussion about this?
No, not really. They'll do their comments beginning of March, I think. But they haven't, they've acknowledged that we haven't. Right. Yeah.
Is there a motion? Do we have anyone like to make a motion on this?
Move approval.
All right. Is there a second? Any further discussion?
Only, I'm sorry, Jim, Mr. Chairman, kind of following on Brian's comment, I mean, you know, there are some specifics in this proposal. I mean, the notification by mail, the specific citation that there's a fine if Section 4 is violated. I haven't read all of them here this afternoon, so I'm just wondering whether, if this is really meant to be a reaffirmation that we're a farming, a pro-farming community and we support agriculture, does the proposal really need to have some of these little, I don't know, zingers in it that sound very officious and kind of go beyond being a cheering, supportive statement on the town's position on agriculture?
So
It seems a little, that particular sentence seems a little
So this is
officious
just
to me.
a warrant article that we are either, we will take a vote on, yea or nay. We're not here to amend the article. And my understanding is all these things are currently in law. This is not an incremental fine. And we have the opinion of town council that where there's a lot of disputes, it's zoning takes terms of those.
No, and I certainly understand this is all already in state law, so it doesn't really make anything, change anything, other than it is asking the real estate community to, or the town to, officially notify people that this is a farming, pro-farming community. And then, this language, specifically cites sort of a fine and other actions that the town's going to take that is not simply cheerleading for farming.
I don't know what language you're referring to.
Well, again,
At the end of section 4.
We've had, I don't know if you were here for our earlier discussion of the sponsors review, just with us.
The issue that Brian brought up, that a copy of the disclosure shall be provided to landowners every fiscal year. And then it says that the next line is a violation shall be subject to a fine. It just seems sort of technical and officious as opposed to saying, we're a right to farm town, which we already are. And if all this proposal is doing is sort of, as the member of the agriculture committee said, if we're just cheerleading, some of the stuff is getting a little detailed. And I'm not necessarily,
Michelle, a question if I may. Doesn't this give the agriculture commission some teeth, or at least some sitting down with the Board of Health?
It's just about making sure that the agricultural commission can fulfill its role to be helpful. If there's a complaint against somebody who's performing agricultural, activities, the agricultural commission will have knowledge about whether they're doing that with best management practices, or, and right now, the agricultural commission there's no loop of communication.
But it's a communication loop, not a appeals loop.
It's a communication.
Thank you. That's the intent of this. I'm sitting here wondering why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And you're saying because we need to reinforce the communication?
There's a few reasons to do it. One of which is that if somebody new moves to town and they, don't understand necessarily that this is a farming community that has a history of farming, that we're trying to preserve that tradition on the island, they might consider that they could, sue Slozix for being smelly or something like that. So this would inform them right away. They would get something to know and say this is a right to farm community. So they would know that. It would head off at the pass perhaps something like that happening. And the other reason is if there is a complaint, then the agricultural commission can perform its function of being helpful to the town and perhaps, acting as a buffer or, easing the way for the complaint or working with the farmer who may be not using best management practices to ensure that those practices are, made better.
That's not happening now.
Not at the moment. The Agricultural Commission is fairly new. This is usually something that an Agricultural Commission does right away. It's almost the very first thing they do in most towns. So over 140 towns have adopted this, and a very large percentage of those have active agricultural commissions that started it. So that's part of the reason, is to put them in the loop communication-wise if there's a complaint.
All right, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor of the motion to recommend this article, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Opposed?
Opposed. Two opposed. All right. That passes. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Please, stay with the hour. I recommend that we pause at this point and continue on with item 7. The date of the next meeting will be next Monday, the 11th. At Ryan's suggestion, what we know we're going to be doing is sending out the, Ryan, maybe you want to speak to that?
Sure. So at some point tomorrow, we will send out individual packets for all the meetings for next week with all the information, or the budget department say. So Monday, I believe, if memory serves me correctly, is revolving funds, and then Tuesday is police and fire, or whatever, or DPW. Oh, yeah, this is actually helpful. Thank you. So Tuesday is plus Wanacommet and Sconset, and then Thursday is fire, police, and marine. So tomorrow we'll send out the individual agendas with all the supporting documentation for all of next week's meetings. So you have it for over the weekend in advance of the meetings. So.
Good. Very good.
Right.
Again, it's a nice improvement.
Yes.
Continuing improvement in your processes. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Before we do that, a quick question. Has there been any movement to consolidate the two water companies, or?
Do you want to speak to that?
There's a warrant article, a home rule petition, put together by the water company. It's under revision now, but, well, I guess actually as an aside, last night the board reviewed a very, very rough draft warrant. It's probably online if anybody wants to start sort of perusing through it. It's in there. If you want to see it, email me and I can send it, but yes.
Jim, I'll be here next week. Kate broke her wrist playing paddle, so we can't go. So I had to cancel it.
I bet you they're not doing it. Yeah. The thing that here's the thing. We very might want to do something too. I would appreciate if somebody comes to me and saying, hey, I know